Good day. This is an attempt to bring you a Bible class since we haven't been able to have any for several weeks now. When we had to quit meeting together, I was in the middle of teaching Luke's Gospel. I had done so the last quarter and into this quarter. So, those of you who are in that class, I hope you'll pick up with us and carry on. I'm going to start back at the beginning and summarize and carry on through. Those of you who are not with us then will get the summary and altogether, we can get some major themes about the Gospel of Luke. Now, it will not be as detailed, almost verse by verse, as we were doing in the class, but enough that you can get a good feel for the Gospel of Luke, which is always my intention when I teach a book of the Bible. So I hope you'll enjoy. And with this lesson, we're going to have some summary things, introductory matters. I call the course Luke's Jesus. Why would I call it Luke's Jesus as if it's his and nobody else's? Well, the Gospels do different things. The Gospels are not biographies as we're used to biographies. They don't take a person's life and try to get about everything known about that person and tell it all chronologically. That's our idea of biography. They didn't have that idea of it. They didn't even have the idea of biography per se. They told episodic stories and sayings about a person to give you a feel for who they are, and that's what the gospel writers did. Matthew, for example, wrote particularly to a Jewish audience who had grown up on the Old Testament themes and prophecies, and he does a lot of that in his gospel. He goes back to those themes and fulfillment ideas to help the Jews understand that Jesus was the Messiah and who he was. Mark, on the other hand, wrote to Romans who did not know the Old Testament, did not have expectations of a Messiah. So his is kind of a gospel of action. Moves faster, tells things shorter, even has some words in there sometimes to explain to a non-Jewish reader what something is. John, I think of as the gospel of the concepts about Jesus. All of those statements like I am are in the Gospel of John. I am the good shepherd. I am the door. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. All of that is John, who starts out not with a nativity story, but with a philosophical idea saying Jesus was the Logos, the Word of God that came to light. So Luke goes about his own way in the episodes that he chose and the words of Jesus that he preserved for us. So what did Luke want his readers to grasp? What did he want them to believe? What did he want them to do? Well, he was trying to encourage an active faith in Jesus, for sure, through a narrative literature, not by preaching. And he wanted to have reasons to believe and reasons for what it means to believe once one does. Let me quote from a book like some of you used to me doing in class, commentary to give you just a little bit of feel about what Luke is doing. From a commentary by Leon Morris. The great thought that Luke is expressing is surely that God is working out his purpose. This purpose is seen clearly in the life and work of Jesus, but it did not finish with the earthly ministry of Jesus. It carried right on into the life and witness of the church. The church does not represent a new, completely unrelated act of God. Luke seems to be saying that the work of Jesus led, in the plan of God, to the life of the church. Many of you know that Luke wrote, of course, the Gospel of Luke, but he also wrote Acts. Luke the prequel, Acts the sequel. We think of Luke as the life of Jesus and Acts as the life of the church. It's probably neat to look at it. It would help us better see what both of those books are doing if we see Luke and Acts as the story of Jesus, his living here and how his people lived because he was here. Luke sees it as all one thing. The divine purpose Luke sees is intimately bound up with the love and mercy of God. A feature of the gospel is the way God's love is portrayed as active in a variety of ways and among a variety of people. Now let me build on that thought. A variety of people. Think of Luke as the universal gospel, not so much to Jews in particular and what they were expecting, not to Romans and what they weren't expecting, not John and his lofty ideas and concepts of how to present Jesus, but the gospel for every man. It's Luke wherein we see many of the stories about the women, the children, the poor, the outcasts, women like several Marys that are named, or Joanna, or Susanna, or widows, or suffering women, outcasts like the Samaritans and Zacchaeus and the prodigal, poor people, disreputable people even, that Jesus mingles among, but is calling them to his ideals and to his kingdom. Here's a way I found that's very good to remember. Take some alliteration. The Gospel of Luke is the gospel of the least, the last, and the lost. Those who were considered least in society, who were considered last and even outcast, and of course the lost. Gospel of the least, the last, and the lost. We'll come back to that time and again as we meet the people that Luke is helping us meet in the gospel. Well, who is this Luke, the author of this book? Actually, when you read the whole block of material of this writer, Luke and Acts, it's anonymous. He doesn't tell us who he is. But from very early on, even late first century, certainly second century AD, and all the way through, Luke is really never questioned as to being the author. The people in the very beginnings of the church age named Luke the physician friend of Paul as the author, and it was never really questioned. The external evidence, it's called, outside the book, from lists and writers who named Luke very early in history is quite strong. The internal evidence points to it being just that person or that kind of person, a physician, very learned. In the book of Acts, some of you probably know that there are sections where the writer is talking about the travels of Paul and he's saying we. The writer was there with Paul. And in other sections, he's saying Paul traveled with somebody else, the writer apparently not being there. With a little detective work, one can figure out that it's Luke is the name in the middle, that he is, when he's talking about we, he's there. When he's not talking about we, he's not there. Luke, what we know about him is not much. He was a companion of Paul. In Colossians 4, verses 10 through 14, where Paul is naming several of the people that he worked with, apparently Luke is a Gentile, because Paul names him after he says of other names that those are the ones of the circumcision, and apparently the ones that follow aren't. Luke was apparently a Gentile. He's called a physician. He was not an eyewitness to Jesus, but collected material from those who knew Jesus. Look at the very beginning of the book, Luke chapter 1 at verse 1. Luke says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word." He never claims to be an eyewitness. He says it was handed down. I think he interviewed people, listened to people, traveled with people like Paul, is where he got this. Then he says, "It seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus." Who is that? We'll get back to it. "So that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught." So Luke, being a Gentile, a physician, a fellow traveler at times with Paul, never refers to having seen Jesus, certainly not an eyewitness to the resurrection. He talked to others about that. We know from those who can translate and understand Greek that the Gospel of Luke is a very high quality Greek. It's compared to the classics of Greek, unlike the other writers who have their own style. So a very learned individual. He either knew the scriptures well, Old Testament, or he listened to those whom he was around quite well. He has Old Testament quotes. He will touch on fulfillment themes. He showed Jews things about Jesus in his writings. Fact is, he's the only gospel writer who mentions the circumcision of Jesus or Mary's purification on the 40th day, things you would think Jews were interested in. These interested Luke, the physician who was gathering history, and he saved them for us. So Luke may have come to the Christian circles in the first place by having been a God-fearer, a Gentile who was intrigued by, even converted to, acts of Judaism. We don't know that for sure, but it certainly fits what we know of him. So when did he write this? Well, it was probably written straight through Luke and Acts at the same time. Took some time to do that, of course, but Acts ends with Paul in prison, Acts chapter 28, which is about the years 60 to 62, that imprisonment of Paul's. So Luke apparently did not write before that. Maybe he started the gospel before that and carried on through up to that time. As we read in the first verse of the book, he says others have taken upon themselves to compile things about Jesus, and now he's going to add to it. And he apparently knows about some of those writings and some of those people. So not earlier than 60, 62, but probably around 70 or after. Now, 70 is when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, a fact that Jesus alludes to in the gospel, including the Gospel of Luke. The scholars debate about whether Luke says something that indicates that that event, destruction of Jerusalem, was already past, or was it not past? You can see them discussing that. Nobody knows for sure. So it ends up being dated somewhere between roughly 62, maybe as late as 80. Luke is named also in the book of Philemon by Paul. He is named also in 2 Timothy 4, verse 11, the last thing we have that Paul ever wrote, probably not long before his death. And he says, probably the years 66, 67, he says, only Luke is with me. So Luke stayed with Paul till the very end. Some interesting things about his being a physician is that historians have long pointed out that in this gospel, in Acts, in terms of the conditions of people, the physical conditions and ailments of people, that Luke uses some more specific language oftentimes. There's kind of a medical interest in the way he says it over the other writers, which makes it interesting. And it's been found out over the last 150 years or so that he was a very reliable historian, being a learned man. At one point, 100 and 150 years ago, especially in the book of Acts, Luke would refer to city officials and government officials in terms of certain terms and the names of those officials. And historian says, well, that's not what that official was called, and that's not the correct title for that area. And little by little, archaeology, as they have uncovered more of those places, more of those names, more of those offices held, Luke gets proven right every time they find something. So let's trust Luke. We talked a little bit about the audience that he wrote to, being a more universal audience and all these people he brings into, but he names in the beginning Theophilus. Who is Theophilus? Well, that's easy. Nobody knows. The word Theophilus is a Greek name, and it means a lover of God. Some people have said, well, maybe he's just addressing that as kind of a generic name for all of his readers. Anybody who loves God would read this. But it's probably the case that it's an individual he's writing to. Overall, Luke probably has the Gentile mission in view, since he was one himself, and Theophilus would have been, at least by his name, was also one. He writes in the Greco-Roman literary tradition, again, not as biography, but as pulling out the parts of the story, the things that he knows about someone to project who that person was when he was alive. He also mentions in the first 4 verses of the book there a kind of certainty that he wants to get across the exact truth to Theophilus that he's investigated carefully from the beginning. He uses a word that in the version I read says, I'm writing it out for you in consecutive order. It may not be that it was all consecutive. Some of that's hard to reconcile with the other Gospels. It may mean just simply that it's very orderly, that it's meant to map out in one's mind a clear picture of who this Jesus of Nazareth was, so we don't count on it all being strictly consecutive as to time, which doesn't matter for most everything we see in the book anyway, to be strictly consecutive. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were recognized very early in the church as Gospels of Christ. When the Gospel of John came along late in the first century, John was recognized as also the stories of Jesus, and in the book of the New Testament lists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John started to be listed together. Luke and Acts kind of got separated. Acts now coming after John in our Bibles, but it's really the continued writing of Luke to tell about Jesus in the church age and the church of Jesus in that church age. A lot of themes carry over from Luke to Acts. Prayers at major events and times, the Holy Spirit, which particularly shows up in Acts. The message of Jesus and the speakers in Acts are so much the same. Of course, the apostles in Acts, when they preached, added that part of the story about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, which, of course, Jesus was not preaching about during his lifetime. He predicted it. He didn't preach about it. What else do we have here? The oldest collection of books, now making up the New Testament, was actually written down by a heretic named Marcion in 140 A.D., and he includes the Gospel of Luke and many of the other books that we know as New Testament books. That's very early in history, when things were not at lightning speed with modern technology. It took time for things to get around, but a lot of those books were collected already. As early as in the 90s A.D., we're hardly talking 60 years after the life of Jesus, a man named Clement of Rome quotes from the Gospels, including Luke. So Luke was written very early, obviously before that. A Christian writer named Ignatius, who died in 107, knew of all 4 of the Gospels. As I mentioned, even opponents to Christianity sometimes unwittingly gave us evidence for those books existing early because they'd quote from them very early. So we knew that those books were already there. A man named in Alexandria, the city of Alexandria, in 130 A.D., quoted from all 4 Gospels. And a bit of old papyrus called the Muratorian Fragment in the 190s A.D. then lists all the New Testament books that we know. So they came together very early and were collected that way. So, bit of an introduction to Luke. Remember, as we move along, that Luke writes about the least, the last, and the lost. Very people-oriented gospel, as Jesus himself was people-oriented. And we'll meet more women and children and Gentiles and Gentile officials and disreputable persons, at least they were thought of that way, and poor persons in this gospel, as Luke intends to build his picture of who Jesus was and then who the followers of Jesus was as you come into the book of Acts and see that the gospel and the church is for all people everywhere. There's some important things we'll be watching for moving on through Luke. So, I hope you'll stay with us in this. Yes, look ahead, read into the Gospel of Luke. I'll try to give a couple of these lessons each week that you can add to your watch list, I hope. And we'll kind of move forward in summary and leaps and bounds kinds of ways and learn some more about Luke. while we're still shut in. Thank you. Have a good day.